So I brought you down to the beautiful Moorlands Farm Fishery today to run you through everything you need to know about pellet and ground bait fishing in the margins. Hopefully catching you a load of F1s so that next time you go out on the bank you've got a bit better idea of how to go about it yourself. So we'll net this one and then I'll run you through everything you need to know about rigs, how to prepare the bait, how to mix it, and hopefully next time you're out on the bank you'll have a bit more of a better understanding about it and it'll just enjoy your sessions or your matches that little bit better, catching some beautiful F1s just like this one. Let's pop him back and we'll get into it. So the first question you're going to probably ask is why pellets and why ground bait? Now the depth we've got down there, around about 18 inches, it lends itself for both baits. When it's deeper I always like to use pellets, so if you're faced with a situation where your margin might be 2.5 to 3 foot deep, you can't get really close to the bank or it's just naturally a deep margin, that's when I would more opt for pellets because it's easier to catch them on pellets than it is ground bait. Ground bait creates this big cloud which is really attractive to fish, and there is ways of getting around that so that you're not foul looking fish and you can get your bait down a little bit quicker, which I'll talk you through later on in the session. But pellets is basically my go-to. I always like to start on pellets. I think that gives you a real good indication of how the fishing's going to be. So I start on pellets to try and get a quick early response, try and catch a few of them early fish that are just lingering but not really feeding, but then there will become a point in the session where pellets is not really working, you're not getting that traction, and that's where ground bait comes into it. Ground bait is great for attracting fish, but the deeper it gets the harder it is to catch them on ground bait because basically your ground bait is going to break up off the bottom. Now you can feed your ground bait in balls, that's absolutely fine, but again you're losing your attraction then. What's the point? You might as well feed balls and micros. So for me, when I feed in ground bait, I like to have that cloud going through the water. 18 inches, absolutely fine. The depth there is not an issue. Anything less than 2 foot, I think ground bait's really effective. Anything over 2 foot, when you've got a lot of fish coming in your peg, I feel like pellets can outscore ground bait sometimes. So I'm going to start on pellets, see how the session progresses. Whether we're catching really well on pellets or not, I'm going to run you through ground bait anyway, just to show you, and then it'll give you an idea next time you're out on the bank just whether you should start on pellets, whether you should start on ground bait. If it was 12 inches for example down there, I probably wouldn't even start on pellets, I'd go straight to ground bait. So 18 inches, like I say, it's borderline, it's a real nice depth, it's not too shallow where the fish are going to be scared, it's not too deep where the fish are going to sit off the bottom, it's actually a real nice depth to catch F1s in. If you're fishing for bigger carp, it's a little bit different, but that's a whole different video on its own. But today, catching F1s, start on pellets and we'll switch to ground bait to hopefully bring some more fish in. If the peg started to fade, that's when ground bait will come into its own. So starting with the actual bait preparation itself, I'll start with the SK2 pellets. Low oil pellet, really important because you want a pellet that breaks down quickly and you don't want a sticky pellet. If you get the high oil pellets, what tends to happen then is they stick a little bit, which is great in certain situations, but it's not really what we're looking for when we're F1 fishing and we're kinder potting with a little pole pot. We want them pellets to melt out of that pot and we want them to break down fast as well, and that's what the SK2 pellets are designed for. So preparing them couldn't be easier. I just stick to the rule of thumb, whatever I put in a pellets I put in a water. So I take a little tub, pour my required pellets in for the day, probably going to put about a pint in here. They're going to swell up as well, don't forget, so you know, don't go filling your actual bait tub right to the top. And then all I'm going to do is take a bit of water and I'm just going to cover these pellets so that they're just enough water and pellets are just starting to pop through the top. So there you'll see the pellets now are just submerged in water. There's an odd one starting to pop through, and then what I want to do with them is just leave them. That is it. Dead simple. Just leave them to absorb that water, and what you'll have then is a real nice soft spongy pellet that releases really quickly. So in terms of micros, couldn't be easier. Just cover them with water, just enough water. When the pellet's popping through, perfect. Now Coming on to expanders, 4mm expanders. When I'm fishing with micro pellets, I like to fish a 4mm. I always find 6mm are a little bit too big, and obviously they're going to swell up slightly. These actual pellets, they're again a nice, I would say medium oil pellet. You know, they're not really high oil, but they're not low oil either. A little bit of oil in an expander is a good thing. It makes them last a little bit longer. Now there's two ways of actually preparing your pellets. You can pump them, or if it's colder or you've got time and you can actually do this before your session at home, all I do is get a little food bag in the corner, I put my pellets in, I just cover them with water exactly the same way as what I've done with my micro pellets, tie a little knot in and keep them tight. Now all them expanders will actually float. When you get to your peg, I have a tub of water, put my expanders in, they float to the surface. A great way of fishing in winter, because what this does, it takes away the weight of your hook. So just like a wafter, which is a boilie that floats, it's semi-buoyant and it takes away that weight of the hook, and when the fish suck the bait in, they're not going to feel something nice and, you know, not nice and heavy, but something heavy. It's not nice to the fish. They'll feel that resistance, spit it out. In the summer, the fish are a little bit hungry. It's not necessary, but this way, where your pellets are basically just soaked in water, not pumped, they do last a little bit longer and a little bit more firm as well. Now, in summer, you ain't going to have time sometimes. You get to the bank, you might be doing a short session, you might just want to get your pellets pumped and you want to make sure they're all sinking quickly. You might be catching loads of fish, so therefore you don't want to be messing about, giving your pellets a squeeze under the water and seeing if they sink, etc, etc. Me being a match angler, I want efficiency. So what I do in the summer is I take the water, I fill the pump right up to the brim. Make sure it's filled to the brim as well, because if it's not filled to the brim, you'll have a little bit of air in there, and what will happen then is when you go to pump it, it won't actually work the same. So just get my little pump, so put the pump on the top, push that on. I'm going to give it a couple of squeezes. I don't want to pump the life out of it. As soon as they've gone, that's it, that's all I want to do. And what this does, it speeds up the process of the pellet actually breaking down and basically absorbing that water quicker. The way I've done that, that's going to take at least an hour for your pellets to fully absorb. So don't get to the match and start doing it this way if you've not got an hour. You need to do that at home basically. This way they'll be ready in 10 minutes. So all I'll do, get rid of any excess water, leave enough so that they're covered, and then just leave them to one side. They'll be ready. Give them 10-20 minutes. Your micros and your expanders are perfectly done. Now moving on to ground bait. We're not going to need loads of ground bait for the session because we're mainly going to be kinder potting. When I'm fishing for F1s, I don't want to be piling in big pots of ground bait. You know, a kilo of ground bait should easily last you most of your session if you're F1 fishing. So all I like to do with this is measure it so that I know I can't go wrong. So I always like to, basically, with this bag of mix, I like to go 2 parts ground bait and 1 part water. And that way, you can get your ground bait nice and claggy, nice and heavy. If you want it a little bit drier, just go like 2 parts ground bait and maybe half a pint of water. But I want this to be nice and heavy, so therefore I want to put my water in, and when I mix it, tidge a little bit more, so it's a full pint. When I mix it now, it's going to go sloppy and it's going to look like it's a little bit ruined. I'll mix it round. It's going to clag up and it almost looks like, oh, I've ruined my ground bait. My ground bait's all stuck together. It's a little bit pasty form. What it needs to do now, because it's a pellet based mix, there's no bread in this, there's no rubbish in it. It's got quite a high oil as well to this mix. The reason for that is it gives it weight. You need a bit of weight so it can get down, but it takes time to absorb the water. So I'm looking for 20, maybe even 30 minutes to let this fully absorb the water, come back to it, and what you'll have is you'll have little balls of ground bait like this. You can break it down when it's ready, push it through a riddle, and in true Blue Peter fashion, this is one that I did earlier, and you can see then after about 20-30 minutes, once it's been through the riddle, you'll have a ground bait that's got all these particles fully absorbed. You can see the little individual pellets and the little bits of high oil, all the little flavourings that are in there. And what you've got then is a lovely ground bait that's got weight to it. So if I want to feed it in a cloud, I can just kinder it out of my pot. It's going to get down. It's not going to be floating off and be all messy. If I want to squeeze it into a little ball to try and get it down, again, perfect. I can get it down to the bottom. And that ground bait now is perfect, but you need to give it time to absorb the water. It's not a mix that'll come round straight away. So that is a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts ground bait, 1 part water. If you want it a little bit drier, so say you wanted to fish it on a feeder, for example, you'd have less water. You don't, because it's got quite high oil content to it, I would say medium oil content. It's not high oil, it's medium oil, I would say. If you did this for a method, what you'd find it's a little bit too sticky and it won't break down. So if you wanted to use it for a method or feeder fishing, you would just add less water and you'd have a drier, more active mix, and then it'll break down a little bit quicker. So give this time now. Bit of bait preparation. We've got some 4mm, we've got some micros, and then we've got his ground bait done. Nice, heavy ground bait. Micros are going to be probably another 10 minutes away. You can still see they're still taking the water on. Another 10 minutes away, they'll be bang on, and your expanders will be fully expanded after about 10 or 15 minutes as well. So leave that now. That's perfect. Bait preparation done. I'll quickly run you through the actual setup that I'm using today. We're mainly going to be catching F1s from anything from sort of like £1 up to £5, but the average being around £2–2.5 pounds. Elastic choice, obviously you just want that to suit the stamp of fish. So grey hydro elastic in there. Got a little reverse bead on there, and then my line is actually trapped behind that knot, and then all that happens is I sleeve that bead over it and it traps it in perfect. Brilliant for fishing shallow, but I also use that connection for everything else. And then I've got 0.17 N gauge as a main line, nice and durable. You know, with margin fishing today, not fishing for massive fish, but you could be catching a lot of them, so you still want it to be durable. Anything less than 0.17, sometimes your rig can get a little bit kinked and you can start getting to little wind knots and things in your line. So by fishing a little bit more heavier and a bit more durable, it just makes your rig last better. 2 number 9 back shots, and then I've got 0.3 of a gram bagger on there. Could use a 0.4, but sometimes just fishing a little bit lighter float just means that there's less resistance in the rig and it's a little bit nicer to fish with. I'm not expecting lots of big carp, so to be honest, I feel like a 0.3 is probably going to be bang on today. Depth wise, we've only got about 18 inches, but like I say, if they're pushing that rig about, if there's a few more carp in the venue you're going to, sometimes step that up to a 0.4. The only difference being is that this takes 6 number 9s, the 0.4 will take 6 number 8s, and I've got that little bulk there sat right on top of the hook length knot, and then I've got 3 inches of 0.15 N gauge. Again, durable. I could fish 0.13, but I've just stepped it up 0.15. I don't think the fish are going to be line shy. And then to finish the rig off, I've got a 16s SLWG, which a 4mm pellet or a piece of worm will go on there perfectly. So when it comes to knowing how to start the session, because it's predominantly F1s, I don't want to go in there with massive big pots. I'm literally just going to start with a small kinder pot, kinder a little bit bait in, see what response I get. Little and often is the key here. People have said it for years and years, but I watch people, they start the session, big pot of ground bait, let's get them there. Big pot of pellets, let's get them there to start with, and then we can feed little and often. That only messes up your peg. If there's too much bait in your peg, there's too much choice, you'll end up waiting longer for a bite, or they'll come in, there'll be too many fish there, and they start wafting your bait about. So start, it's not negative, but just start with a small amount of bait. So I've got the small pot on here. When it comes to volumes of bait, obviously there's 3 different sizes of these fast release pots. We've got the small, medium and large. The large is basically what I would use for ground bait, so we can forget that one for now. I've got 2 choices of pot here. Do I go for the small or do I go for the medium? To kickstart the session, there's a good argument that you could start on a medium, get a little bit of bait in and switch to a smaller, but it depends how good the venue is. Today I'm expecting bites pretty quickly. I'm expecting the fishing to be good. Last time I fished a match here at Moorlands, I had like 170 pound on this lake, so I know there's lots of bites to be had. So I'm feeling like the small, through past experience, is probably the right amount of bait. So first thing I want to do, take a 4mm expander, roll it onto my hook. These expanders, when they're pumped, if you pump them in warm water, like lake water for example, this water is probably around about 18 to 20 degrees at the moment, your pellets will expand a little bit bigger. I love that. I feel like it turns your 4mm more like into a 5mm pellet, and I feel it's just a little bit bigger. When the water's coloured, great. If I was fishing in the winter for F1s though, I would probably do them in the bag style method, And what the bag style method does, cold water, it makes the pellet expand slower, and by tying the knot down tight, it stops them from over expanding, and they probably stay around about a 4mm size. But today, I don't mind that extra little swelling of the expander. I feel like it, like I say, it turns them into more like a 5mm. So all I'm going to do, get my pot, overload my pot so that it's full to the top with pellets, and then I press it in slightly, and I don't want to over squeeze this, just press it in enough so that when I turn it round, it doesn't fall out. And hopefully we can feed a bit of bait, get a reasonably quickish response. So what I'm going to do here, the shelf is dropping off slightly further. As we go out into the lake, it's going deeper that way. So I want to flip my rig away from the actual bank itself, look at my marker. I've got a little bit of tape on my pole here. I've hold that in my finger, and I put my little finger, so I hold that in my index finger, I put my little finger on my knee, and I'm going to sit in the same position every single time here. So I flip my rig down the slope, pull it back. Now my pole pot, as I drop it down, it's going to come back towards me. So I'm going to lean forward an inch to compensate for that. Turn my pot over, put my pellets on the water, 1, 2, gently release it, bring it back to my knee, and as I lift my rig and put it in position, I'm going to be smack bang on top of that little pile of bait. And then I'm not going to move my rig. I'm not going to lift and drop it. I'm just going to leave it right on top of it, as if I've set a little pile of bait on the bottom. My hook bait is sat right in, hopefully amongst the middle of them micro pellets, and I can wait for my bite. Now, if I don't get a bite, I need to feed again to draw the fish back in. So I'm not going to sit here long. 2 minutes, because it's the start of the session. I want to get a bit of bait in quickly, just like if you was feeder fishing, regular casting early doors to build the peg up. Once we've got the fish there, then we can be a little bit more patient. But to start with, you know, we might get lucky and we might catch one really quick in the first couple of minutes, but if we don't, once that 2 minutes is sort of passed, then I'm going to start thinking about feeding again. So there, didn't take long, probably about 40 seconds. Doesn't feel like a massive fish. Probably a pound maybe, 12 ounce a pound. Perfectly hooked, as you'll see there in the top lip. So you know your presentation's right, you know your hook bait is sitting nice, you're not too far over depth, etc. We'll get him back, see if we get another one. So that didn't take very long. All I'm going to do now is just repeat the process, fill my pot up, my little expander on, get to my marker, flick it down the shelf, turn my pot over, bait in position, rig in position, and basically just fish this now until it dies. If it doesn't die, there's no need to switch to ground bait, but there will become a point where you might catch here for half an hour, you might catch here for 2 hours, you might catch here all day if the fishing's really good. Now, when it gets to that point where you're losing that attraction, you're not getting fish coming in as quickly, so I can see there's a little line where I know the fish has come and had a look at that. So now I'm just waiting for it to make a mistake, pick me up bait up. When it gets to that point, then there's two things you've got to think about. Are you feeding enough pellets? Do I need to go up a pot size to the medium and try and draw more fish in? Or do I need to switch to ground bait? So I've just missed a bite there. I've actually just got a bit of rubbish on my hook, so I'm going to take that off. So back in, I'm going to feed again, set my trap again. So even though I've only just fed, I'm going to set my trap again because I'm going back in. The fish might have disturbed that pile now. So pellets in position, rig in position. I know there's a fish already in my peg there waiting. So hopefully as I've fed, it won't take too long to get this bite. So they're obviously happy coming to pellets. But like I say, if they're being a bit funny, then ground bait is a great alternative. So that one's probably had it in its mouth for a while actually. I thought I was getting a little bit of a line, or I didn't want to strike at that. You're normally looking for fast indications, but that fish was obviously really confident, and he's obviously picked my pellet up but not swam off with it. So a couple of pulls at puller. I think this one's slightly bigger than the last one, probably more like the average stamp we're probably going to be getting today. There we go. So it's probably £1.50. I know they go a little bit bigger than that, but that's just your standard typical F1. There's loads of these in this lake, High Meadow here at Moorlands. Probably the best F1 lake on the actual complex. The others are mainly carp, skimmers with a few F1s. This one's predominantly F1s. So again, 4mm pellet, roll it onto the barrel, make sure you've got loads of hook hiding in the actual expander. That way you're not going to be striking it off all the time. Don't just nick it like a maggot, really roll it into the actual pellet itself. And then I'm just going to repeat the process. So the bites at the minute, they're coming quick. Don't need to draw fish in because the pellets are doing that job for us. So I don't need ground bait just yet because I'm getting the fish coming to pellets, and they're much easier to catch on micros and expanders than they are trying to catch them on ground bait. When you start fishing with ground bait, you're creating a cloud, you could foul up more fish, they waft your bait about more. But when they're not happy and they're not coming to pellets, that's when you need your ground bait. So there's a fish swirling in my peg now. A little bit of a bite there, missed that one. So try and keep that rig nice and still, using them back shots to keep it against the actual bank. And it's important to make sure that you can get against the bank if you can. If you can get against the bank, it offers your rig a bit of protection. If I fish off the bank, then the fish can push your rig about a little bit more, and then that tends to lead to liners and stuff. So the fish are getting slightly bigger, bit more of a darker coloured one. Again, he's up perfectly in the top lip, probably getting on for £2 that one. Nice chunky fat belly on him. So that shows like the power of pellets. Just get rid of that bit of rubbish. Now just notice my back shots. This is one thing that's very common as well. Just notice my back shot and my float and not positioned where I was. So as I've hooked that fish and it's ran into the reed, I always put a little bit of Tipp-Ex on my actual pole tip here, and that tells me my float has slid up 2 inches. So as it's ran through the reeds, it's pushed my float up like that. Be aware of that, because if I go in next chuck, what might happen is I might hook a fish a little bit deeper because I've got more line on the bottom and it'll suck it in. I won't see my bites as quickly. So it's always worth, I always mark it to the bottom of the bristle where it meets the actual body. But that's a great little tip. That's another thing I see a lot of people do, is they're not aware of them little changes. Straight away I've spotted that something's not right. If my back shots have slid or my float slid, I can just hook it back up onto my pole, double check it, and I'm ready to go again. So I think what we'll do, we'll catch one more on pellets, and then even though we're getting plenty of fish coming in the peg, I'll just explain to you a little bit about ground bait, and then you'll know roughly what you need to do. At the moment, I see no need to change from pellets because the fishing's good, I'm catching fish regular, the fish are coming into that bait within a couple of minutes, I'm not having to wait, which tells me that pellets is doing the job. It's bringing the fish in, it's getting me lots of fish in the peg. I would fish this until the peg basically dies a death, or the fish are not coming in, I'm not getting a response. But while I'm getting a response, you know, it makes sense to stay on pellets basically. I feel like if I fed ground bait now, it'd probably get a little bit messy. Obviously you're pleasure fishing today as well, so you can have a lot more fish coming to you in a match situation when there's more people on the lake. You're not going to have as many fish competing. That's when ground bait really comes into its own. It drags them extra fish in. A little bit of a swirl there straight away. As soon as he's come in, because I'm not feeding lots of bait, I'm not giving them lots of choice. Therefore, they're just absolutely nailing it every single time. This one's a lovely fish. Again, perfectly hooked. Smack bang in the top lip. You can't get better presentation than that. And this one's almost, it is a blonde actually. It's one of my favourite fish, a blonde F1. You see that goldenness on it. You don't see lots of these. Real lovely fish. Real fat bellies on them as well. You can see how chunky they are. It's actually called a blonde F1. It's mixed with something like a chagoy koi, or I can't remember the actual name of it, but it's bred with an actual koi, that's where it gets its orange yellowiness from. Real special fish, like look absolutely beautiful. So I'm going to fish this for a little bit longer, wait till my peg calms down, and then I'm going to swap it to ground bait and show you how to fish with ground bait if the scenario come where you needed to switch from pellets. At the moment though, there's absolutely no need to switch from pellets. All ground bait's going to do is bring more fish in and probably make them harder to catch. And at the minute, they're easy to catch. Pellets is doing its job perfectly. You know, why make fishing harder? You want it to be as easy as possible to catch the fish, and that's why I always like to start on micros and expanders. So once you've had that initial run on pellets, it does tend to fade. Your options are, you can keep fishing through it, nicking an odd fish, but I always feel like ground bait gives you that sort of like second wind. It pulls fish back into your peg. And the reason for that is the cloud that the ground bait creates. Obviously the particles, they're still pellets, but the ground finder, that's why they're called ground bait, and it just gives more attraction. The fish can all of a sudden not be interested in pellets. You cup ground bait in and they're straight back onto your bait. Now, when you're feeding ground bait, what you've got to remember is it's not as filling as micro pellets. So you can feed a little bit more, you have to feed a little bit more. Whereas we've been fishing with a small pot, this now would not be enough bait. If I filled that up with ground bait, it'd just be a little tiny little thumbnail of ground bait basically. If I made it into a little nugget, you'd only be feeding sort of like that much, and it's not enough. So you have to up your pot size here, and this is where volume of bait is really important. So I'm going to get rid of the small, and I'm actually going to bypass the medium as well. If there's loads of fish coming in your peg, or if it's shallow, then medium can be great. So I'm not saying don't ever use the medium, or I'm not saying don't ever use the small. Small could be brilliant in the spring and the autumn when the water goes a little bit clear and you just want a little bit of cloud. But 99% of the time, for me, I opt for the large. So that's the pot I'm going to choose to fish with. I feel like that's about the right amount of bait. It equates to sort of like a small nugget of ground bait, if you like. It's similar to, I would say, a walnut sized ball of ground bait. So that to me is a perfect amount to get a bite. If it was a little bit deeper, you could also feed it in little bit balls as well. So feed it like that, and what that'll happen is as you cup it in, it'll get halfway down and then it'll start to break up. So as long as you don't squeeze the life out of it, that would just sink straight to the bottom and then you'd lose your attraction. But let's say it was 3 foot and you needed to fish with ground bait because micros wasn't working, you just softly squeeze it and that'll get down sort of like the first foot of water, and then the water will take on the ground bait and all of a sudden it'll start to break down. The last little bit would go through as a cloud. So you can feed ground bait in balls, but me personally, I like to feed it loose. So let's have a little go on this. Now you might be thinking, what hook baits? You can use all sorts of different hook baits. You could use sweet corn. It's probably my least picked bait when I'm fishing for F1s. I love it for carp, but for F1s it's probably my least picked bait. But you know, if there's lots of roach in a venue, sometimes corn is a good option. Where allowed, meat could be a good option, but most of the time I normally fish with maggots or worms. The fish have spawned now. I feel like worms becomes a great hook bait. After spawning time, I feel like worms is great. So I'm going to take a piece of worm, sort of like a medium-sized dendrobina, hook it right through the top and out the side slightly. Now, a full worm is probably going to be a bit too much for an F1, so I like to normally fish about 1 inch to 1.5 inch piece of worm. So I'm going to snap this one right in half. I'm going to put on probably, it'd be 1.5 inch in size, I would guess. Fill my pot up exactly the same way as what I did with micro pellets, so nothing changes here. The only thing that I might do sometimes is if I'm getting a lot of fish in my peg, sometimes just feeding ground bait, the fish come in, they're looking for something to eat, and all you've got is this dusting of ground bait on the bottom. There's nothing for the fish to actually eat, and you need some particles in there. So sometimes what I will do is I'll mix ground bait and micros 50-50. So we know the fish want to eat pellets, they come in on it initially, but then they lose effect and they're not as attractive, the fish are not coming to it. So we want a bit of cloud, but we also want a bit of food content in there. At the moment, I'm just starting on neat ground bait, but as the session progresses, you might find that you're getting more and more liners on ground bait and you can't actually catch them as easy as what you did on pellets. So then what I'll do to slow the fish down a little bit, stop them going mental for the cloud of the ground bait, is actually give them something to stop and eat. And that's where, you know, you could add dead maggots, you could add casters, bits of meat, but 99% of the time, again, I just feed micros and ground bait. So we'll start on ground bait. We'll see how we get on with this. If need be, you can always add some micro pellets into it. So nothing changes here. You turn your pot round, hold it on the water, 1, 2, gentle lift up, get that rig in position, hold them back shots against the bank so your rig doesn't drift away, and then hopefully, where the peg's been a little bit calm and dead, as soon as because we're going to have pellets still in our peg as well, they're not going to vet all them pellets, so there's going to be a little bit of food there. But now hopefully we get a second wind and we get fish coming back to it, they start to gain confidence again, and then all of a sudden, if they're too confident, that's not even a word, if they're too confident, then what'll happen is I can add some micros to it and get a nice mixture between attraction and also some food content with the micros, and hopefully the fishing will get a bit easier and the fish will become easier to catch again. If we're just catching them really easy, just feeding ground bait, I'll just do that because I'm not filling the fish up. You know, if I can just feed ground bait and get away with it, I had a little bite there, and I don't need to add any micros because we're catching them easy, you know, brilliant, because that's less bait, less choice for the fish. I'm never going to fill the fish up. Like, you can feed ground bait quite positively and not fill the fish up, whereas with micro pellets, if I was putting a large pot of micros in every chuck for F1s, I'd probably find that, you know, I'll fill the fish up pretty quick. It'd be a lot of bait. You know, it's great for carp, but for F1s, we probably need to just tone it down a little bit. Whereas with this ground bait, you know, we're not really ever going to fill them up. That's actually the first little carp of the day. It's, it could be, yeah, it's a little ghost. Yeah, it's a little carp. I was going to say it's a ghost F1. It's not, it's a little carp. And that's another thing that you might find as well. We could be fishing with pellets and all of a sudden we start putting this ground bait in and you start attracting different fish. You might start catching more carp. You might start catching smaller stamp fish some days. Like, ground bait doesn't always attract the biggest fish. Sometimes it attracts smaller fish. Sometimes it'll attract roach and things like that. But the amount of times I've been fishing, fished with pellets, caught a few F1s, as soon as I start putting ground bait in, I start catching more carp as well. Where there's a lot of carp in the venue, that happens a lot. Like, I don't know why. It can work, like I say, sometimes it'll draw more smaller stamp fish in. So if you go to a small stamp venue where the fish are not massive, ground bait can be better than pellets. And if you go to a venue where there's a lot of big fish, again, ground bait can be better than pellets. But pellets is always my go-to starter point. I feel like if you can catch them on pellets, they're really, really easy. But, you know, you go to a slightly harder venue, somewhere that gets fished a lot, somewhere where the weights aren't as big, 95%, 99% of the time, you tend to find ground bait will get you out of trouble and it will always catch you a few fish. So all I'm doing here, half piece of worm on the hook. There we go. Now, I wouldn't say the fish have ever really left us today, but this is just like when we first started the session again, where we're starting to catch fish. They're coming straight back to it again. And what I'll be doing is I'll always be looking as well, while I'm fishing, I'll always be looking to see what my peg's doing. Are the fish still boiling there? Is there any swirls? Is there any mud coming up? Again, another little carp. I don't think there's any big carp in here, but it's not an F1, it's another carp. Like, we've only caught probably 2 of these all day, and all of a sudden I've just had another 2 in 2 chucks, albeit not big fish. You know, it's a carp. It's drawn different fish into my peg than what the pellets actually did. So my worm's absolutely fine. Leave your worm on the hook. You want your worm to almost get a little bit softer. Worms are quite tough when you first use them, and then as you sort of like, the fish have chewed on them a little bit, etc., they start to soften up and they're actually better. So again, ground bait in position. There's actually a fish in my peg there now. Yeah. Foul up that one. Now, that's because I'm too many fish sometimes coming to my bait. So when I was looking down there as I hooked that fish, I'm looking down, I'm not seeing anything. That time, I've put my rig in, the fish are already in my peg. They're starting to swirl before my ground bait's got set and in position. And this is what I was saying about, now is the time where I'd start thinking in my head, I need to start adding micros into this because they might start going a bit daft on the ground bait. Ground bait is such a great attractor. Sometimes it attracts too many fish, and then when there's too many fish there, that's what can happen. You start foul looking an odd fish. I've hardly foul looked a fish at all, if at all foul looked a fish on pellets. Third chuck in on ground bait, I've foul looked one, and that's because in that depth of water, they're already sat there waiting, and you imagine one fish in that depth of water, you can easily lead to fish brushing into your rig, etc. So let's go and have another go on that. But already, now is probably the time when I'm thinking, maybe need to put some micros in this. And what that'll mean is less attraction, because obviously, instead of feeding 100% ground bait, it'd be 50% micros, 50% ground bait. It's giving them something to actually get the head down and eat. Whereas with ground bait, they're going to be milling about, sifting around on that bottom, and potentially sending them a bit nuts, if you like, you know, I want something to eat and there's nothing here to eat, like, and then they start swimming around your peg a little bit faster and start playing up a little bit. So again, that didn't take long, but I feel like, yeah, another one foul looked. That is a perfect example. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show you exactly how I mix up. When I get to this problem now, I'm going to show you exactly how I mix this up and get it wet. So I'd take a mixture of my ground bait. So I'd have my ground bait here. Let's say we go 2 handfuls of ground bait. I'm going to do the same with micros. You can measure this with a pole cup if you want. 2 micros. That'll roughly give me a 50-50 mixture now of ground bait and pellets. So what I've got in here now is a little bit of food content. There's something for the fish to actually eat. And this is exactly what I'd be going through my head. If I started to have problems, now I might go in and not foul look another fish here, but while it's done that, I feel like it's the perfect time to try and demonstrate it to you. So I've got a mixture of 50-50 micros and ground bait. Obviously you can imagine some ground bait will come through, micros will fall a little bit quicker. Let's just see if this is a little bit better. Sometimes you don't get the response you want straight away. It might take 2 or 3 feeds and then you start to notice the difference. But you know, let's just see if we can get one here now. They've actually got some bait in the peg now to actually eat, which is good. Before we just had loads of ground bait. Well, not loads of ground bait, we had some ground bait in our peg. There wasn't actually anything for the fish to eat. So after, what I'm hoping here is after 2 or 3 chucks, this might start to calm down. And you don't just have to go 50-50 mixture. You could go 80% micros, 20% ground bait. So all I have to do now is if I started having problems foul looking fish, like I said, I don't like feeding my bait. So that one's perfectly hooked, top lip, top corner of the lip, my worm's fine, the fish is perfect. Let's get him back. If I started having problems with this now, what I could do is take that pot off, go to the medium, and maybe go 80% pellets, 20% ground bait. And I can sort of adjust my mix to suit. But the amount of times, like just that little bit of ground bait, 60% pellets, 40% ground bait, there's no set rule with this. If I want to dilute this mix now, say I'm not getting as many bites, what I can do is I think, right, I want a bit more of attraction. Let's just put another handful of ground bait in there. So now I've got 3 handfuls of ground baits, 2 handfuls of pellets. That's a 60-40 ground bait mix. If I want to dilute it a little bit more, I could put a little bit more ground bait in. Or if the fishing starts to get really good, I can go back to a 50-50 mix with an handful of micros, or I can go a little bit richer in micros and put another handful of micros in. So now it's a 60-40 mix of micros and 40% ground bait. And then when I start going more towards pellets and less ground bait, I don't need to feed as much because there's food content in there. So what I can do then is drop down a pot size, go back to my medium, and that might be just enough bait to get a bite. You remember we started on the small and then we swapped straight to the large. Now I can go back to the medium. So hopefully this might not bring as many fish in my peg, and what I can do is get my rig set, get my rig in position, catch that fish and start again. So let's just see if a medium's enough bait. What we want is the fish to come into your peg reasonably quickly. You know, you don't want to be waiting for bites, but what we don't want to do is be seeing fish sat in the peg waiting. If fish are sat in the peg and waiting for the bait, it means we've probably got too much bait in the peg, so you need to drop your pot size down. So it's quite simple. It's not, you know, it's just a case of working out that ratio between how many pellets, how much ground bait, how much to feed, so working out your pot size. And all of a sudden, like, them problems of 2 foul hook fish on the trot, which we all experience, most people would be like, oh yeah, I never foul hooked a fish. When in reality, that's what happens. You foul hook a couple of fish, then it's up to you to solve that problem. So like I say, the ways of solving it is working out how much to feed. Do I need a full pot? Do I need a medium pot? Do I need a small pot? If I went to a small pot now, I don't feel like that'd be enough bait when it comes to ground bait. So for me, medium and large is probably the 2 pots to go with. If nothing's happening, I'll go back to the large, because sometimes it's not enough bait to draw the fish in. So if I was all of a sudden catch 4 fish really nice there, and then I don't get any more bites, I go back to the large pot, because I feel like I'm not dragging the fish in enough, I'm not feeding enough bait to draw them in. But if I'm having lots of problems and I'm getting too many fish coming in the peg, which is what happened there, as soon as we switched to ground bait, we're getting too many fish showing, and all of a sudden they're waiting for it because it's drawn them in, or it's drawn extra fish in, and we foul up 2 fish. We couldn't get as rig set. The whole idea when you're fishing in the margins like this, whether it be carp or F1s, is you want your bait to get to the bottom, and you want the fish to come in, and your hook bait is sat in position. You catch a fish, you start again, repeat the process. So just think about how you're going to go about it, how you're going to attack it. Think about volumes of bait, think about ratios of bait. So there, I've got two baits. I've got micro pellets and I've got ground bait, and then I've got my separate tub, which is a little bit bigger tub, just so I've got the room to mix it and move it about. That's the ratio that I'm settled on at the moment. For example, it's a 60-40 mix, pellets, 40% ground bait, and then work it out. If the fishing's really good, chuck some more pellets in there. If the fishing's not as good, you need to attract the fish, and that's where your ground bait comes in, because your ground bait's a brilliant attractor and it'll bring more fish into your peg. So hopefully you learned a little bit from that video. F1 fishing in your margins, a perfect time of year now to get out and go have a go. The water's at its warmest, the fish want to be in that shallow water, and you can have some brilliant days doing it. You just got to think a little bit about your approach. You know, think about your pellets. Like I say, always start on pellets, a great starting point. But if you go to a venue quite regular and you know it well, you might think pellets doesn't work, I'll just start on ground bait. That's absolutely fine. But if I go to a venue that I'm not familiar with, then I always like to start on pellets, see what sort of response I get. If the fishing's really good, you might fish pellets all day. If the fishing's not as good, you might find that you have to feed ground bait to get the fish in your peg. I enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next video.